Ist Mikro an? An? Hallo? Ist die Lautstärke? Ist okay? Very good. Welcome, everybody. We're going to get started. If you could take your seats. Don't have seats? Great. Thanks so much, everyone. Sorry that we're running a couple minutes late, but that allowed us to ensure that we had all of our important guests here in the room. Now that that's accomplished, we're going to get started. First, let me say it's an honor and a privilege to welcome you all to our first Berlin Africa Forum. I want to thank, in particular, our guests who valued this meeting enough to make the trip from Africa, as well as our friends traveling from other European capitals. A special word of thanks as well to Commissioner Bankole, whose early endorsement of this initiative gave it wings back in the early summer. Finally, we've had the best of fortune with our partners, the EU and the TANA Forum, and our supporters, the Robert Bosch Stiftung, the Gates Foundation, and the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We thank our neighbors just down the road in Berlin as well, the German MFA. Before the panel discussion, which is here, allow me a word about the aims of the Berlin Africa Forum, and then the thinking animating our focus over the next days on Africa and Europe in the emerging global order. Our hope with the forum was to create a pan-European and cross-African policy community, united by the belief that the Africa-Europe relationship has vast, if as yet unrealized, potential. It's heartening to see from the group assembled here how much the sentiment has resonance. Today is our inaugural meeting. Building off the momentum generated here, we'll take forward conclusions in subsequent meetings, alternating between Africa and Europe, all with a view to fashioning consensus where dissonance impedes the relationship. More on this in a moment. Now, a word setting out why the focus rests on the new global order and the relationship that Africa and Europe can plot out together as this order emerges. As ECFR's work maps out new forms of geopolitical power, from tech to culture to climate, we also interpret the shifting balance of power across the globe. Where we saw the liberal order of 1989 coming slowly unmoored over the last decade, travel in that direction has accelerated dramatically since the onset of the pandemic. Crisis did not bring us closer together. It increased and surfaced the currents of competition. Where we find ourselves now is moving from that post-1989 order into uncharted waters. The war on Ukraine is a symptom of the upheaval inherent to that change, but it's not its cause. Indeed, the risk for the Africa-Europe relationship is that the change to global order gets reduced to a single issue, Russia and Ukraine. There are reasons Africa might think that. In the aftermath of Russia's attack on Ukraine, great efforts were made to secure Africa's support to pressure Russia. Europe's request to Africa adopted a binary framing. First, is Africa with or against Europe vis-a-vis Russia? And second, is Africa with or against the rules-based order? But when Europe posed these questions, Africa thought it heard different ones. Is Africa ready to join Europe's side in the new Cold War? Is Africa ready to join Europe's fight against Russia, rather than Europe's campaign to uphold the rules-based order. We need to push back against this mistaken framing because the Africa-Europe relationship going forward into the new global order is not a referendum on Russia, nor is it a referendum on Europe's relationship with Africa, although it has illuminated the areas where work is needed. So if the new global order is bigger than the Ukraine conflict, then what does it mean? I believe it means opportunity. But it's opportunity only if we understand the war in Ukraine as a strategic caesura. If we look past the immediate and dire humanitarian consequences and see the Ukraine moment for what it really is, a moment of reckoning with the global or Europe relationship, allowing the two blocs to align in the new order more solidly. Which areas of the relationship should we best harness this moment of opportunity to improve? We've proposed 4. They're not the topics of day-to-day diplomacy, but leitmotifs that shape African and European positions across the full spectrum of the relationship. These 4 encompass interests, values and principles, competition and exclusivity, and multilateralism. Not wanting to preempt our closed-door discussions tomorrow, which you're all participating in, I'll hold off diving into these topics now, but promise to unpack these at the conclusion tomorrow, where I hope many of you will join us again. With that, let me hand over the floor to our able moderator, Chris Marilong, and the stellar panelists who've been patiently waiting. Thank you all again for joining us. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you, Chris.
So let me start off by thanking Theo Murphy for those excellent opening remarks that really help us contextualize the debate that we're going to have today. In actual fact, not a debate, but a discussion that we're going to have today, which will hopefully unpack some of these key themes which were spoken about by Theo in his opening remarks. I think the idea of this discussion today is not really to focus on our distinguished panels' talking points, which they've no doubt set up in the prelude to this engagement. But it is really to probe you a little bit and to ask you some maybe wicked questions that will help you maybe understand the moment that Theo tried to describe to us today. I think the idea also is for us really to find common cause and common ground between our two continents at this moment which Theo has described as a shifting global order. A shifting global order which has been marked by that period post, or rather pre-1998. As I was thinking about the debate today, it was not missed by me that in 1884, possibly in this city, the Berlin-Congo Conference was held. And it was perceived as really a starting point for what has been described as the scramble for Africa. Now, is this reconfiguration that is being described here yet another scramble for Africa? Or is it Africa scrambling for relations with the global north? These are some of the questions that we need to contextualize. What will shape the formation of this reconfiguration? The title of our conversation that we've been asked to debate today is Africa, Europe, and the Emerging Global Order. There might be a few assumptions in the question that we are being posed with today, that there is a shift and there is a new global order. One of the questions, and you know they say forearmed is pre-prepared, is there indeed a shifting global order? What does it look like? Are we moving to a multipolar world? Are we moving to a world where maybe Europe and others form a coalition to the exclusion of Africa? Does Europe see Africa as part of this coalition in this multipolar, unipolar world that may emerge post the conflict in Ukraine. What will be the importance of energy as we have seen in this instance? What is the crucial importance for us to understand the dynamics, our histories that are most likely to shape the context and inform the relationship? Without engaging in a very prolonged monologue here, let me begin by introducing our interlocutors here today. We have a distinguished panel with us, and I really look forward to engaging with them. On my far right, we have Bankole Adeoye, who is Commissioner for Political Affairs, Peace and Security at the African Union. Your Excellency, you're most welcome. Thank you for joining us and coming so far to help us unpack some of these vexing questions. And then in the middle, of course, we have Helena Koenig, who is Deputy Secretary General at the European External Action Service. Thank you for joining us, ma'am. And of course, last but not least, and on very short notice, so we are very grateful that you have chosen to come here and share with us today. We have Jennifer Lee Morgan, who is the State Secretary and Special Envoy for International Climate Action at the German Federal Office. Thank you for coming. Just to ensure that there's no offense and that all protocols are observed here today, I hope you don't mind me referring to you by your first names. Perfect. Excellent. Good. So to give you a sense of the format of the conversation today, I'm going to engage our colleagues here in a very quick fireside conversation to try and get their thoughts on the nature of the debate today. And then we're going to ask you to join in the conversation through a question and answer session where you will be able also to freely ask whatever questions come up to your mind in this session. So let me start off with Bankole. Sir, we talk of this global order, and Theo framed it as a global order commencing in around 1998. Maybe in your own words, you can tell me about, what you expect a post-1998 global order to look like, and what is the position of Africa in such a global order? Are you optimistic?
Thank you so much. I hope. Yeah. Thank you so much, Chris, for having me. First, on a lighter mood, let me just thank Theo and his team for inviting the African Union to this engagement. The room looks much like in 1884 or back to the 17th century in Westphalia. I do not see many female or youth participants. I think we need to be more inclusive as we engage on a theme that is of relevance to the world and to this. So I think your question is very apt, but I will first of all probe, and I think to the audience, is there a world order? Does it exist? Whose order? Who designed it? How does it operate? Is it a possible enterprise to have a global order? What are the contending options? Can we talk of an African perspective of a global order? How do we remake it? What should be the hallmark? What should be the benchmarks? How can we possibly be engaging on a theme when the world is interested in Ukraine? Is Ukraine the precipitating factor for us being here at all? So overall, I will state my views, which some in this room know very well. But since I'm not a scholar, I will quote Henry Kissinger, who wrote the book, The World Order, in 2014. And I'm sure I didn't know about that particular book until I started preparing for this. Let me quote him. The book is titled World Order, published in 2014. Reflections on the character of nations and the course of history. What does he say? What did he say? No truly order has ever existed. That's Henry Kissinger. What passes for an order in our time was designed in the German region of Westphalia. And we're in Berlin, I think it's almost close. Nearly 4 centuries ago, conducted without the involvement or even the awareness of most other continents or civilizations. 2014. Essentially, it is questionable that the order we see is like summer and winter. It exists because
maybe about more inclusive forms of governance, and what others would contend should be more efficient forms of governance, particularly when we consider what might be happening in the UK around the governance of their finances. But less said about that, the better. How are we shifting with regards to this contextual understanding of the global governance systems that you refer to here? Is it inclusive? Is it going to be more effective or less inclusive?
I think it arguably can become and should become more inclusive. But we also know that the difficulty with the multilateral system is to change it. And the more you are, unfortunately, the more difficult it becomes to change. So I think that shouldn't make us to give up. But I think it actually also requires that we have much more bilateral dialogues on I'm not talking bilateral countries, actually. I'm talking European Union, African Union, Europe, Africa, and thereby, I think, go through some of the issues that don't necessarily unite us in order to come to the areas where we do look at things on the same way. And I do think multilateralism is one of them. And I do think from that you can get into some really good proposals and trying to push the agenda forward. Because I don't think we will be able to push the agenda forward if we're not united between the global south and whatever we call the other, us, the rest of us. But I do think we have to work on it together. And for me, it's evident. It's only through more dialogue, not less, we can do that.
Indeed. And Jennifer, one of the things that is one of these vexing questions that we face is in your field of specialty, which is in climate. In around November last year, we all witnessed what happened at the COP. I think it was the COP 26, and issues around questions of the just transition, just energy transition. And it really talks to what Bankole was really warning us about. It seemed during this moment that there wasn't really a rethinking of the inequality around this transition in energy that must occur. But it was really an attempt through debates around decarbonization to almost give the global north a get-out-of-jail-free card for the emissions that they've been responsible for decades at the expense of the development of the South. What's your view?
Well, I think First of all, I think we're living in a world of shifting tectonic plates, geopolitically and on the climate piece. I think it's very clear that in the climate area, where to start? I think, first of all, industrialized countries are responsible vastly for the impacts that are now happening and impacting the most vulnerable the most intensively. And so I think that means that developed countries, Germany, Europe, others have to take the lead in both addressing it and driving forward the transformation to an inclusive and prosperous, zero carbon resilient world in a very short time frame, right? And be working to support countries to adapt to the impacts that are happening already and to be open to discussing issues of loss and damage, which are also a very big thing coming up in the next COP. I think the implications of that in the context of the emerging shifts that we are in, I think is around partnership. I think it is around a much greater sense of listening and responsibility and finding how to work together in a way to meet development goals of developing countries in that just energy transition demonstration. I mean, there's a just energy transition, and then there's also climate justice, just to put that terminology out here as well. And I think, you know, it means that for countries like Germany, the importance of working with partners in the Global South has gone up tremendously, partially as a sense of responsibility, partially as a sense of equality and equity, and partially because looking ahead, we think those are the partnerships that we're going to need to bring stability and security to the world and also our own people and people in Africa and in other developing countries.
So it sounds like what you're describing, especially when you talk of energy and the just transition, is that it's not really shaped by altruism on the part of Europe, in the sense that what we are seeing maybe is Europe forming or seeing the need to form closer strategic partnerships with Africa out of self-interest, out of realpolitik, because of the impacts on energy that have been caused by the war in Ukraine.
Jein, as one would say in German. I mean, I think that the partnerships, the work that Germany and Europe has been doing in Africa and in other countries for decades on energy access, on trying to work together on development priorities. I don't know if that's altruism. I think that's responsibility and a sense of what we should be doing and what we're hearing is needed. I think Germany tries to work very closely with partners to respond to what's needed on the ground. I think that as we go forward, there is a risk that what you're talking about happens.
Yep.
That Europe, or not only Europe, goes to whichever country, we can name them, and says, we need green hydrogen, and we want it now, right? And I think for Germany, it's incredibly important that the energy services, that the energy access is actually the first priority of our partnerships. And then if it is possible, also, because there is such immense capacities on renewable energy, also then to be looking at, okay, can there be a partnership around green hydrogen exports that would then bring foreign currency into countries? Then we need to do that together. That's our goal.
Yeah. So, Bankole, here we hear, you know, maybe this false dichotomy where I talk of altruism and self-interest on the part of our partners in Europe in terms of their strategy. What are the shared and common values or the normative framework for Africa that will shape our strategic engagement with Europe? Do they exist, or is it maybe a bit more disorder?
No, they do exist on paper. They do exist. Every AU-EU Partnership Summit reiterates the partnership principles of equity, sovereign equality, shared aspirations, values, and norms. Absolutely. But in practice, it doesn't seem to be working. And that's why most African countries question if an order exists. But the world is shaped in a power play that is represented in multilateral global governance. And that is the United Nations Security Council.
Right.
So the first support we need from Europe is to represent the world in the current Security Council. However, in the long term, from today, Africa wants a UN Security Council that is legitimate, that is democratic, that is reflective of the inclusive world we need. COVID-19 showed us that the world is one. Humankind is one. Therefore, we cannot ignore this. Yes, I agree there are shifting balances, the realities of a new continental global order, depending on how you look at the role of this global south, the BRICS, and the rest. But we need to live by the shared aspirations for a peaceful global order. And one natural theme that comes to mind is climate change. But we also have terrorism, violent extremism that is not unique only to Africa, that is indeed of North African character, but has become a number one challenge. In that context, you need to look at the peace enforcement dimension. How do we address today's challenges from a different perspective, not what the UN Security Council is used to? Protection of civilians, protection of the environment, protection of the responsibility to protect. But these issues are not in the context of responding to Africa's need. So a new world order, or an emerging one, must be fully reflective of the cost of history that Eric Kissinger addressed.
So given what you have said, help me understand the way in which many of our states in Africa voted at the United Nations with regards to the resolution, with regards to the war in Ukraine, and seem to indicate more affinity with Russia. And unlike maybe Europe and NATO, not necessarily with Ukraine, who were under invasion. That shows a real difference in approaches. What accounts for this? And more importantly, maybe help us understand what was being indicated by some of the African states who voted in that fashion.
Let me say I should try to also perceive what member states who voted for, because speaking to most of them, the number one priority is that the world exists on double standard. And I think that's what our friends in Europe need to understand more and react to. The second point is that for us, it was almost an even split. Those who supported and those who voted against. Very few actually voted for.
Yep.
So the going forward, what Africa is saying is that they see the world as very Europe-centered, US-driven. Therefore, what happened in Ukraine is not a question of the principle of condemnation of the sovereignty of Ukraine, but rather pointing to other parts of the world that this had happened before and the same momentum was not there. But let me say, as Antonio Guterres said last week at the General Assembly, our world is in big trouble. So how do we save us? How do we save ourselves from hell, as Dag Hammarskjöld said back in the 60s? The UN was not created to save humankind, to take humankind to heaven, but to save it from hell. So how do we save ourselves from hell? Listen more, work together, work together, work together. We are not doing that enough. Are we listening to each other? Are we inclusive in our deliberations? Did we see reasons? Did we engage the African countries that voted for and that voted against in the UN General Assembly?
So Helena, here you go, an explanation of sort of a diametrically opposed position on this really vexing matter of Ukraine that is presented by Bankole. How would you respond to his justification?
No, I think in many aspects, we had exactly, I think, internally that reaction. What happened? Because I think also from a European perspective, and actually I do not think it's altruism, but we have been very supportive. I mean, we are biggest investors, we are lots of development cooperation over years, and that was not for our own gain in any way. So it's been there.
So you've been supportive of whom?
Of Africa, on African
Oh
countries.
no, I
know.
think,
I'm coming there.
Yeah,
coming there.
I wasn't talking about
I
Africa.
know. So no, but with you're talking about the vote. Yes. So with that, from our perspective, when we looked at the vote, I think it's fair to say we didn't really understand how did this happen, which just shows us that, okay, we have been, for me at least, we've been speaking too little. If we actually see the vote, and there is a sense what for us would have been almost obvious, not because we've been supportive of Africa before, but we have a lot of commonalities and a lot of common values. The next reaction, I think, was, okay, let's go out and discuss why this is. Let's try to understand, which for me at least is a lot better. It's a lot better reaction than saying, "Ooh, bad," not good at all. So I think what we've been trying to do is really to listen more, and I think we also have come to the next step from that discussion is, okay, with some countries, and that I've heard also very much when I've been visiting the UN, it's like, yes, we understand, and we actually even agree, but for us there are other things that are more important. Whether we agree on whether they're more important or not can be as it is, but I think we've come to a stage now where we've definitely heard that, yes, we need to listen more, and we also need to look at the effects of the aggression, what is happening on a number of different areas. And it's not that the aggression has started these crises, but they've actually contributed to making them worse in certain sense. I think we see it particularly when it comes to food security, but also, of course, energy. So in a sense, it's just fast forwarded. So I think the immediate reaction is, let's try to understand better why this happened, but after that, how can we actually address it? And I think for me, that is the most important thing. How can we address this together, the shortcomings? And I think for the moment we have some actually acute shortcomings or acute crises that we need to address, and we can only do that together. And in a sense, we have to leapfrog almost some of the problems which were there from the beginning and try to instead solve and really start on a new page, but really being cognizant that not taking away from the responsibility of what has happened 100 years ago and onwards, or whether it's on climate or whether it's on history, but acknowledging, understanding, and then move forward.
Yeah. So Bankole, we're hearing sort of this juxtaposition on. You seem to indicate that it was put to African players that the Ukraine was important as a global issue that should have been addressed. Our European counterparts say maybe there are other things, and there was a misunderstanding. There's more commonality and common cause to find solutions to other issues. Is that the view and perspective that you got from this issue?
Ukraine affects all of us. I mean, let's be frank. And it was, it's very regrettable what has happened, what's happening in Ukraine. And let me make the point that the sovereignty issue for Ukraine is number one question mark also for Africa. Africa continent is the weakest when it comes to protecting its sovereign space. What do I mean? Armed non-state actors all over the place. 40% of a country like Burkina Faso is controlled by armed groups, terrorist groups. So in terms of the question, the Africans see themselves as the need to protect. Every communique of the Peace and Security Council has a line on sovereignty and territorial integrity. But in terms of what the member states think, and I do not want to speak for member states, but I can say for sure that the feelers we are getting is exactly what I've said. They see double standard. They see the West as dominating. They see the West as not listening, despite one critical factor: enormous goodwill for the West in Africa, enormous cultural, historic affinity from education to the history of colonialism.
Yep.
That's sometimes considered as very essential. But the listening part, the respect, mutual respect, equality, is missing sometimes as we engage.
So Jennifer, given this debate, maybe from a German perspective, does this mean, given the fact that the Ukrainian conflict is most likely going to be protected, that in your engagements with maybe African counterparts, that Africa might be a strategic location, not just for these new resources that will drive the fourth and the fifth industrial revolution, but certainly maybe even around energy, alternative energy supply locations? Is this maybe how Germany might play it as one of the biggest economy in Europe?
Well, I think the first thing is a desire to pause and realize that we didn't listen enough, and that we didn't understand enough. And I think in a way the vote and the situation now is representative of something that was deeper. And in a way, I guess our hope is that it can open a space now that we can have a conversation on eye level. Not just about energy, we can talk about energy and climate, but on the goals and the hopes of African nations, of youth. I very much agree with the inclusivity points that you've made. I think that's essential, and how we can be working together to understand those goals and to be better able to respond. That doesn't mean we'll always agree with everything, but at least we'll have a better understanding. So I think a real commitment to much deeper dialogue, more regular, very practical things that I think we have to make happen. And so I think that, is the dominant piece for Germany. The issue, and I think the climate issue and the security issue and the justice issues around climate are also a very big priority for Germany and for the European Union as well. And wanting to look how we move forward in a way that addresses the equity issues that are there. We are, maybe just to the energy piece, because I think right now the effort really in Germany and Europe is to become as self-sustaining on renewable energy and energy efficiency as we possibly can. We have to replace Russian fossil fuels right now, and I think it's quite extraordinary that we've gone from the numbers we had down to where we are today. That also means that there is I would say there will be new alliances, there will be new power structures, right? It may not be just based on, it will be partially based on resources, right? Looking at the 100% renewable world that we're trying to go for and where those resources are, and those are the conversations we want to have, but also can be based on other things in the future, on innovation, on technology, on workforces. And I think we want to go in with eyes wide open and explore that world with partners in Africa.
Excellent. So with that, I would like to really invite our audience to participate in this discussion. Please show your hands if you'd like us to bring a mic. Kindly introduce yourself. Tell us who you are, maybe who you represent. First question here up in front.
My name is Charles Huber. I am a former MP from the German Parliament. I was involved in the committees of Foreign Affairs, Economics, Energy, and Development Strategies. My actual position is a conseiller spécial du président de la République du Sénégal, special advisor to the president of Senegal. But here I speak, let's put it this way, on the capacity of my experience in both worlds. So if we talk about a global view, not just in a globalized view on economic issues, but just the trust in institutions. Meanwhile, we have a lack in trust of institutions. And the thing is, also what makes it different and maybe more precarious, more difficult in Africa. When you say the institutions develop a strategy, if you see it, if you describe a human body, you have muscles and a skeleton. A skeleton is the institution, but the question is the institution able also to build muscles? If we talk about a strategic plan, like the European Union, the Americans do, the Chinese do, in a system of a developed country, in comparison to a formal economy, which does not create taxes whatsoever, where you can finance things like proper health care, like insurance if you're unemployed, you have the time to follow and to believe in a strategy. You can say, okay, if we have a proper strategy in 20 years, this and this is going to happen.
Sorry to cut you off, sir.
Okay.
But do you have a question?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. In an informal economy like in Africa, you don't have that time because you have no private equity, as if you talk about the population. And in these discussions, what I miss is the perspective of the population. And so I wrote down a couple of questions, and I already made a long introduction. Let me just pick out one. A principal question is, why did you just start to focus on Africa when you saw a competitor like China? My question is, why didn't you develop an own approach instead of criticizing Africa of a stronger cooperation with China? And the other question is, why do you think that Africa is responsible as a victim of climate change, of economic distortions, of geopolitical distortions, to follow the road of the Western world, and why you threaten them, excuse me to use that word, and threaten them and say you have to face consequences if you don't?
Okay, let's leave it there. A couple of questions here. What I'll do is Maybe Helena, we can start off with you on the question of, are you only interested in Africa now because your competitor, strategic competitor, China, is making headway in Africa? Is that what it's about?
No, actually, I don't think so, because you could make, when it comes to China making headways, you actually have it all across the world, which would then say that we haven't been interested in anything of the world in the last decades, which I genuinely don't think it's true. I think we've been very interested in Africa. We've been very keen to work with Africa. Then you may say competition sharpens minds. And if anything, perhaps, that's perhaps what I would like to say. We had to up our games in proving that we can be the choice for Africa, the partner of choice for Africa. And I think that is really what we would like to do. And it's not imposing ourselves, but saying that we have built, we have a number of principles. And a lot of these principles are not necessarily because we think we will gain in importance by using them. We genuinely think that this is the best way to develop, and we've seen that it is the best way to develop. So I think that's really what we're trying to, with our offer, we say that, okay, you can go on certain principles, you can go it without principles or without any strings, but if you put a complete offer, which means that you get a road or you get a system of something, and you have actually around that support for education to use your digital system that just came in. There may be standards that makes that you have security of your system. And I think that's what we've been forced to think about. What is our offer and how broad is it? And it's an offer which is good for Africa, good for Europe too, arguably, but also that makes sense for sustainability aspects, whichever form they take. So, no, I don't agree that we just woke up now, but I think we need to do it better, and I think we realize that.
Good answer. A question over there. Let's start off with Dr. Munyai, and then Prof. Bio, yeah.
Well, let me join others. My name is David Mnyai. I'm a professor of international relations and politics at University of Johannesburg in South Africa. I think being here, it's a matter for some of us revisiting the site of the crime. The one that you mentioned, the Berlin conference. We cannot restart the conversation without visiting that site. And it's good that we're here. How can we return to the same site of the crime without telling the truth in terms of what happened? We apology and acceptance, justice for and fairness in terms of what happened. Reparation. You cannot talk about this without revisiting the entire enterprise of colonialism. Genocides committed in Namibia, particularly by Germany, and others. At least Germany is trying, even though it's not doing it in a fair way. Reparation for Israel, much better, but for Africans, just peanuts. And these are double standards, where you don't respect your partner. You don't see your partner as equal. So you cannot move without revisiting these issues as a first phase of a really true partnership. And on issues of climate change, it's similar issues. Africa's emission is less than 3%. And you can't tell Africans to kick, start, and jump and do what Europe is doing. Of course, there's a need to move to clean energy, but it has to be done in phases. And more questions need to be asked. What kind of technologies, new technologies that are developed? Who's developing these technologies? Should we jump into Europe's phase given what it did in terms of damaging the environment, what kind of reparations are required? So, and lastly, what is the clean energy world order? Will be inequalities in that world change, or it will be worse? My view that it will be worse, because you require Africa to buy new technologies that are not produced in Africa. So there's so much that needs to be raised, debated in a fair way.
Great.
And yeah, finally, if you allow me, Chair.
Absolutely, finally.
Yes. Europe, and is someone who speaks with keen to Europe, Europe in a very awkward situation. It is rising in this so-called New World Order as a pillar in itself. But I don't think Europe has realized that it is a pillar in itself. It's dragged itself into, on one side, Washington and Beijing, and it seemed not to know its space. So I think the day Europe understands its own space, it will be in a better position to speak to Africa in its own language, in its own terms, than mimic others, whether Chinese or Americans. Thank you.
Good points, Prof. there. Jen, is there anything you want to respond to in those statements?
Well, I think, first of all, I just want to say that I hear the desire to be heard. I hear the desire not only to be heard, but to discuss and not revisit, but understand what happened. I hear reparations. I hear how the past, that we can't go to the future until we face the past, and that we can't be repeating. We can't, in a way, do a new colonization in the phase that we are right now. I think in regards to energy and the future and the development pathway of each African country, I mean, obviously you are sovereign nations. So those are decisions that you make. I think the moment, and I think that it's very clear that the financing that's needed, the technology that's needed, has not gone at the scale that's needed to African countries. And I think that's something that we very much want to dive into, not to create new dependencies, but actually to look at how to have those development opportunities. I guess my sense or my experience working more with civil society, I have to say, in Africa, that's more my background, is a civil society background, is that the youth and people with whom I speak are really looking for the local decentralized renewable energy solutions, many of which already exist. And so the barriers there on financing are real. The barriers on reducing risk are real. I think one of the things we haven't touched on are the Bretton Woods institutions and the financial order, which clearly is broken. And so I guess that's one area that very keen to dive into and see how to scale up the development goals in an equitable way. How can we get that financing moving in an equitable way? Obviously, debt issues are also massive. I mean, we've talked about Ukraine, we've talked about COVID, but we haven't really named, I mean, just the debt crisis. So that, I think, is a conversation that is absolutely here and now. There's proposals that have been put on the table that we're looking at and would be keen to hear thoughts.
Thanks, Jennifer. There's a lady over there. Prof, I see you. I'm going to come to you.
Yes, I'm Ingrid Ham. I used to run the Bosch Foundation many years and before, but actually I have an initiative called the Global Perspectives, and we are very much into the dialogue with Africa, so the European-African dialogue. What I would like to emphasize is that Europe needs Africa for many reasons. I mean, geopolitical, but not only geopolitical, we need new partners. Also, for our economy. I mean, we have a very sensitive relationship with China that might break apart in some pieces someday. So we really better look for new markets in Africa and to develop it. And Bretton Woods and the financial crisis Africa is in is a major, major point to intervene and to enable the African countries to get cheap money to heal their financial crisis. So this is a very important point. Germany especially, but whole Europe had been really supportive to Africa for many, many decades. That's no doubt. And it's not to say that Europe was not on the side or was not supporting. But the supporting had a different, unbalanced relationship. You know, we helped, we supported, and I think we really have to change our relationship into a relationship that means you are a partner, you have interests, we have interests, let's find a balance in between the interests. But really take some serious. After the G7, Macky Sall and his Minister of Economy, Amadou Hott, had been really embarrassed. And for example, to give Africa, the African Union, a seat at the G20 would be really a needed step. And to think about the architecture of the Security Council with perspective to Africa is also, and it's not that it's a nice move or a nice gesture. It is really, it's our interest. I think it's really our very selfish interest to get in good terms with Africa.
Thank you, ma'am. I don't think that needs much of a response, so let me try before I go to Prof. Sir, over there. I recognize you, ma'am. Go ahead, over there, closest to the mic.
Thank you. My name is André Langwurst. I'm French-German lawyer and historian, and basically active in renewable energies. I think, of course, what Professor said is extremely important to have a look as well on history and its colonial history. But what is more important right now is not to close the doors, but to open the doors, and as well to see what Europe faces. There's a huge lack, particularly in renewable energy industries. We need workforce, and we need as well the people. So open the doors, and that's an encouragement, particularly for our ladies from Germany and from Europe. Open the doors, send in youngsters from Africa to get a good education, because that's going to be the starting point as well for renewable energy projects in the rural areas. And I think we should start in rural areas to make sure that the people stay there, that they develop their business over there, and that we encourage the youngsters to do something. Just a last reminder, something like 3 years ago, there was a set prize for startups. 5 prizes have been dedicated here in Berlin, and 2 went to Uganda. So what we need is to encourage the youngsters to do something, to be entrepreneurs. And concerning the money, we need credit guarantees. Something like 5-6 years ago, there was an EU-African Renewable Energy Summit. What was demanded at that time is credit guarantees so that we can finance the project. They are profitable. They're profitable. But we need to kickstart somehow, and credit guarantees is one of the key points. Thank you.
Got you. Thank you very much. The lady there, and then we'll move back across this way.
Thank
I
you.
note your hand, sir.
Thank you so much. Nikki Wekahunda, I'm with Open Society Africa. So one of the ways we've, EU, Europe, and Africa has always collaborated is through development aid, right? We're not talking about that. We need to change the way in which we use development aid. We know that, yes, we've given, the agreement was that, at least 7% of ODA is supposed to go to African countries, but we know very well that there's been very little change. We're not responsive. So how are we going to start engaging with civil society? How are we going to actually utilize aid programs differently? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bankole, any comments? Are we recognizing the crucial role of civil society, but more importantly, we've got to break this aid cycle that Africa has been in?
Okay, I'll take that last if you permit me. I just wanted to have a review of all the questions that
Go
were
ahead.
made. Definitely, this emerging world will remain competitive, like in every other enterprise. Indeed, we expect China, we expect the EU to compete for Africa, but in the interest of Africa, not in self-interest alone. Meaning, it's a work together. I think that's very important. The 1884 Scramble for Africa was not African. There was no African in the room. The new scramble, if it exists, must have Africa together, because we have priorities set 50 years down the line now, almost 40 years to go. The African Union Agenda 2063. That's my first point. The second point is that the African Union, somebody mentioned genocide and the history, the legacy of colonialism. The African Union is the only body that has established in its legal framework 3 exceptions to the sovereignty rule: genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. When that occur in any member state, the African Union, the Peace and Security Council can intervene without being invited. That's a total divergence from the UN non-interference in domestic affairs. So you can't cite it. And it's from our history. So the history has informed Rwanda especially, the genocide against the Tutsis. So we are more progressive than many other continents. But we also need to do that in terms of our enabling environment for investment.
Sorry.
The third point I would like to make, it's about the nexus between peace,
One
security.
last point, please.
Between peace, security, and development. And most of what I've been hearing today seems to be in the economic side. You remember, such investment can only happen in a peaceful, secure environment. Finally, about China, is that Africa, the West needs to, global West, needs to see beyond conditionalities for cooperation. Focusing on human rights alone. Human rights exist. They are part of our legal framework and our ambition. But conditionalities will not work. Somebody mentioned Bretton Woods institution. Finally,
we
development
got
aid.
you. Yeah.
Yeah, development aid must be effective. And no, we are no longer talking of development aid. We're talking about effective development effectiveness. The Busan process that speaks about financing for development, that speaks about global South-South cooperation and capacity building. I thank you.
The gentleman here in the red tie.
Thank you. Thank you. I am from the Spanish Minister of Foreign Affairs, Alberto Virella, Ambassador at Large for the Africa Plan, our strategy with Africa. Of course, we do have to listen to Africans. We have to listen to each other. That's very easy to say. Maybe we should work more in a different kind of conversation. But also, I would say that we have to read Africans. We have to read African philosophers. We have to read African think tanks, analysts. We have to read African Union 2063 agenda. And a lot of priorities are there. And I would ask, African Union, when dialogue negotiations take place with EU, really using the 2063 African Union agenda, in which one easily find that, I take an example, industrialization is at the core of structural transformation. Did you, from the African side, have chosen not to propose the European Union to work on industrialization because you prefer to have other partners? Or, I mean, this is a concrete question. Thank you.
Tough question there, Your Excellency. So this is how we're going to do it, because I'm completely out of time, and I see that we have probably 3 other questions. So we'll do it this way. We'll start with the gentleman at the back, and then we'll move forward to this gentleman with the blue tie, and then we'll end with Prof. Bayo.
Thank you very much. My name is George Mukundi. I'm with Maendeleo Group and also an adjunct at the University of Cape Town. Fascinating conversations. When I was growing up, as children, often young kids take home the things they've picked from other kids when you're playing with. The rule was, for most parents in the village where I grew up, no matter what it was, tiny or big, you had to return it with serious embarrassment because you'd have to show how is it that you ended up with someone else's ball. Where am I going with this? One of the often questions asked of many of us who end up being able to access Europe because we can get a Schengen visa, because most of our people can't, is that how do you go to spaces where there is no equity, as it were, for the lawyers in the room? He who comes to equity must come with clean hands. Tomorrow we'll have a session on shared values. And I'm sure some of these conversations will be there, and perhaps I'm already advertising that session. And the reason I do so is, do we have shared values, the Europeans and the Africans? Because that, for us, was one of the key values that we, from inception as kids, was hammered on us. And we know there is the issue of democracy and governance, which is one of the often said value by the Europeans. Do we share the same? And I ask because it's at the heart of this issue, because we have beautiful sayings when we speak in these conferences, in meetings. Yet, one of the key concerns on our leaders is, are they accountable? Are they corrupt? Are they governing badly? And we also ask, is it equally the same on the other side? One of the biggest challenges for Africans is not that, yes, indeed, we don't have issues. We have a lot of issues, by the way, and we concede. But we wonder and ask, half of those things are also because our people or your people are blind to them, or they ignore them, because they in fact work in concert and hide a lot of our problems with your spaces. And I'm talking about illicit financial flows and accountability. Do we make that happen? It's not a question, it's a remark, really to give an appetizer for tomorrow's session.
My appetite is uncontrolled right now. Sir.
Giovanni Carbone, head of Africa program at ISPI, the Italian Institute for International Political Studies, and I'm a professor of political science in Milan. Let me join forces with the lady who spoke a few minutes ago with my question. We know there's a gap between the two sides, Europe and Africa, and I've heard a few words maybe too many times tonight. There's need for a dialogue, for conversation, for listening, for hearing, for respect. But I think that's gone on for some 20 years or more, at least. And on one hand, my impression is that when we talk dialogue, we actually think we're going to convince them. And in fact, Helena, if I may, I can't remember your surname, sorry. You talked about being the best partner of choice, showing them that our development model is the best model. So why not adopt it? I rather think, and I'm asking you, don't you think that when we talk dialogue, we need to find a balance, as the lady was saying, in between different positions? That means meeting halfway between our interests and African interests, to the extent that we can identify European interests and African interests. And isn't there a problem? I mean, are we ready to meet African positions in terms of migration, vaccines, LGBTQ rights, democracy, the will to negotiate with jihadists in some countries, UN reform? Back at the African Union and European Union summit in February, virtually all African demands went unmet. So we keep organizing occasions for dialogue, but then the end result must be meeting halfway. And that's tough. I mean, I don't know if I am myself ready to meet halfway, but yeah, I wanted to ask you whether you think that maybe, yeah, we should also include this other part of the question.
Excellent question. I didn't get your name again. Giovanni. So what I suggest we do is we take our final question, and then I'll afford you each 2 minutes to respond to the questions and also to summarize, and then we'll close off for the evening. Go ahead, sir.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much. There's a lot to say, and I'm grateful that Giovanni came before me, because I think part of my concern is a concern about an individual who jumps on the same spot and jumps even harder the next time on the same spot and expects that somehow a solution will emerge. We've been talking. I mean, the relationship between the two continents is an old one. It goes back into antiquity. Something went wrong along the way, 500, 600 years ago. We've said we will correct this after independence. Macmillan talked about a wind of change. We go to dialogue after dialogue. It's easy to say dialogue, but in fact, a dialogue where we gather to discuss my problems, and you conduct yourself in a manner that suggests that I have a monopoly of problems, and you have a monopoly of solutions. It's a problem. And the commissioner mentioned double standards. In a world in which we also see that in your dialogue spectrum, you play a different hand with different actors in the international system. So Helena, when you say, let Africa do it with Europe bilaterally, I'm skeptical for the simple reason that what you dialogue with Africa takes a completely different tone and tenor, and what you dialogue with China or the US or any other actor in the international system takes a different tenor. And it speaks, therefore, of fragmentation rather than a united action to reform a system which we all agree is broken. And one can list all the problems. At the end of the day, when we talk about shifts in the international system, I can only understand those shifts from my corner of the world. You can understand it from your corner. Yours is a corner of power, privilege, perhaps even entitlement. Mine is a corner of looking for a way to get my head out of water in order not to drown, almost as a permanent condition. And it is this kind of situation that has produced what I call the decolonial generation in Africa today. That is simply saying, perhaps we are actually better off being, telling our partners to leave us alone. Do you mind? Can we just get on with our stuff? When we are ready, we can talk to you. But the truth of the matter is also, given the asymmetries of power, that Africa is way too important in the eyes of Europe to be left to Africans alone. Jollof rice is good for you. If you don't eat it, we will force feed you.
Thanks, Prof. Thank you. Excellent. So with that, your responses maybe in 2 minutes and your closing remarks. I know we've compressed it, but forgive me for my poor time management. We're absolutely out of time.
No, thank you, and thanks to the audience for the questions and the comments. I think mainly they were comments. But I can say for sure that, as Prof. Bayo said, Africa has a choice. And that choice is a value-driven partnership. That choice is about equality, equity, mutual respect, mutual responsiveness. That's what Africa desires. That's what Africa wants. We have very deep relationship with the European Union. Very close, particularly the Department of Political Affairs, Peace and Security. Indeed, without the European Union, we may not have a department. In terms of support, strong support from the EU. But it does not mean that we cannot have a voice when there are contending issues. So in practice, we must relate to our shared values. And those shared values, I used to work for NEPAD, came up back in the transformation from the OAU to the AU. Africa changed. No uniform head of state will be allowed anymore in the midst of the assembly. That's democratic commitment. Good governance is spreading as fast as it could. I'm sure the shared values session tomorrow will relate to all this. But we need we have done our own self-introspection. We've done our own reviews, and we're gradually getting to the point where our dialogue with ourselves, the partnership with our regional economic bodies, our partnership with our people, with the civil society is getting bigger. We're setting up a network with think tanks. We're engaging with the civil society more than ever before. It's even in our books that we must engage civil society. So it's not the Africa of old. Africa is turning a new page. But that page may not be the same hymn that we want to sing with Europe or any other partner. So when we want to partner together, we must go along the same. That smart partnership that we want to build must also respect our culture. LGBTQ is not about human rights for many, many African countries. It's about culture. It's not religious. So these are points that I'm making, that when it is not in Africa's interest, you take your gospel to another place. Not in Africa. Most of our countries do not believe or live by those rules. But let me end by emphasizing one thing. I'm a realist, and I believe strongly that Africa needs to play a lead role in today's world. How does Africa do that? By building its own resources. Partnership does not build any country. It's in-house. It must be inclusive from within before the international community comes in. And the ambitions, as someone said, 7 aspirations from sustainable growth and development, industrialization, to the last one, which is Africa wants to be strong, united, resilient, and influential as a world player. You need to come along with us, not to lead us. I thank you.
Thank you, sir. Ma'am.
Thanks. I'll go through a few things also. To start with, starting with a comment on development cooperation, and it's actually linked to our engagement with Africa. And I actually don't think it's completely true that we haven't changed or that we're not trying to get better. And like I said, I don't really think that is an altruistic motive behind that, because we've gone from traditional development cooperation. We've been trying budget support, which is much more based on the plans of governments. And now again, we're trying to build our cooperation, partnership, whatever we call it, actually based on African countries' plans. So it's not necessarily us pushing, but trying to do where we have a meeting point. That's first point. When it comes to conditionality, and conditionality is not only LGBTQI plus rights, it's actually a lot about governance also. And in our discussions with African countries, very few African countries have a problem with a governance concept. It may be that it's difficult to implement, and if that's a problem as a conditionality, I think it would be difficult, and I think it would be difficult for both sides to say that is not legitimate things to actually bring up. So for me, the conditionality, yes, certain parts of conditionalities may be not acceptable, but I think the main part when it comes to our assistance and our support does not have those kind of conditionalities. It's actually conditionalities that will make governments work better, will make it easier for people, companies to invest, and actually make it better for people, very much along the lines of the principles that you mentioned yourself, Excellency, before. When it comes to the offer, and I did say offer, the whole idea with an offer is that you can take it or you can leave it. You are, as we said, African countries are free, independent nations. There's nothing you have to accept for us. So we actually have to show, whether you call that convinced or not, is a different. Of course, we would be convinced that there are merits to our system. That doesn't mean that you have to buy everything of our system wholesales, and you're free not to do so. If you don't want to take our offer, you think there is a better offer, you will take that also. And that's what I'm, in a sense, saying, that we have to up our offer or be more clear what we think our offer entails. And that is very much about sustainability. It is about lack of indebtedness, not getting into debt. It is about the whole green agenda. And that is, again, as I said, on offer. Now, if indeed, leave us alone, we don't want you here, there's nothing we can do about that either. If there is a decision that you don't want to speak to us, or you don't want to work with us, that is also your sovereign decision. But it's not what we hear. I more hear, yes, we want to cooperate as equals. And we want to cooperate where there is full respect. Now, when we come to our offer, and I'm not a big believer in 50-50 being married myself, it's never exactly equal on every question, some of it may be, but that doesn't take away that you are letting yourself, even if you come with an offer, the whole idea with listening and discussing is that, okay, these things may work for us, these things may not work for us. And yes, it's not that we are totally unable to adapt. Of course, we have to listen to things that would work differently in an African context. And we should be ready to adapt to that also. Then there may be principles that we actually cannot adapt because we have constituencies also who actually provide the money and that we think are very important, and they were just stuck in trying to convince.
Sorry, Helena.
Just on that, for me, it's not dialoguing is really not an option because there are too many things we have to solve together. And obviously, we're not against a multilateral system or multilateral solutions. I just think it could be a bit easier sometime to reach that when you also in parallel have a dialogue with a smaller group of countries. And I definitely would like the African countries to be in there.
Thank you very much. Final words.
I mean, I heard many things. I heard a lot about there's a lot of dialogue, but we need to make sure these dialogues result in things that are in the interests or of African countries, and that it's just not dialogue for dialogue. We have this in the climate negotiations right now. There's a Glasgow dialogue on loss and damage with no outcome. I can completely understand the frustration in that. But I guess maybe what I would just like to contribute, just listening a lot and also learning a lot. I was really pleased that I could jump in because I wanted to come and learn a lot, which is the sense that that we are in a moment, that there is a desire to find those, we are interdependent with each other, that I think from a German European's perspective, there is respect before, but growing respect for the role of Africa on the world stage, for the role of Africa in bilateral, for the role of Africa in all the various places where it is active. So the question that's coming to me is, in a way, how to shift those dynamics, how to do it together, right? And I guess the question in my mind, and maybe this is because what I do every day, is, in the climate crisis, we are in a moment where I think there is a moment where we can be working together, where there is a readiness from Germany and from the European Union to look at how to have both the local, I mean, if I take just the issue of adaptation, to take the local, which is so important, and the inclusiveness there, to take the local and the inclusiveness needs on development and energy access, to look also at the issues of peace and security, and to be making concrete, whether we call them offers, whether we call them partnerships, together, that forges a more stable, equitable future for the two continents that are interdependent with each other. So I'm not here tomorrow, but that would be my challenge back. How to shift these, I mean, that's a decades-long, centuries-long conversation, I know, but I feel like we're in a moment right now. And maybe it's just because I work on on an issue where it's just, all of it is so urgent. But if we have this little opening, then how can we step into it together with respect, with recognition of the past, but also looking into the future and readiness to do that?
Thank you so much. What a wonderful way for us to end our conversations. I think what's left for me to do is really to thank your excellencies for your excellent presentations today. I was particularly moved by the deep insight and the thoughtfulness that you have demonstrated in your observations. But let me possibly also take this opportunity to thank the European Council on Foreign Relations for bringing us together to have this important conversation. What is quite apparent is that we need to have more and more of these conversations. But the conversations must not just end with talk. I think what was quite obvious from what was said today is that action is required. And I hope that by the time we get to the end of our conference on Friday, we would have accepted your challenge to actually come up with concrete resolutions and solutions. Solutions that are based on the compromise that I believe must happen between our two continents. It cannot be a winner-take-all. It cannot be one that is fraught with, of course, the difficulties of the tensions of the past. But we are challenged at this crucial moment, I believe, whether it is a global turning point, whether it is a turning point for just Europe or maybe for just Africa. But what must happen is, in our view, is the need for us to really come together and find these solutions. Ladies and gentlemen, let me also thank you for your time and for your contributions. It's been great moderating this panel. Thank you. Thank you so much. That was wonderful.